Hello and welcome back to Button Buddies Book Club. We are continuing our reading of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, Chapter 4, Paragraph 5. There was the sound of a clap of thunder in my ears. I may have been stunned for a moment. A pitiless hail was hissing around me, and I was sitting on soft turf in front of the overset machine. Everything still seemed gray, but presently I remarked that the confusion in my ears was gone. I looked around me. I was on what seemed to be a little lawn in the garden, surrounded by rhododendron bushes, and I noticed that their mauve and purple blossoms were dropping in a shower under the beatings of the hailstones. The rebounding, dancing hail hung in a little cloud over the machine, and drove along the ground like smoke. In a moment I was wet to the skin. "Fine hospitality," said I, "to a man who has traveled innumerable years to see you." Presently I thought what a fool I was to get wet. I stood up and looked around me. The colossal figure, carved apparently in some white stone, loomed indistinctly beyond the rhododendrons, fucking bushes, through the hazy downpour. But all else in the world was invisible. My sensations would be hard to describe, as the columns of hail grew thinner. I saw the white figure more distinctly. It was very large, for a silver birch tree touched its shoulder. If it was of white marble, in shape something like a winged sphinx, but the wings, instead of being carried vertically at the sides, were spread so that it seemed to hover. The pedestal, it appeared to me, was of bronze, and thick with verdigris. It chanced that the face was towards me. The sightless eyes seemed to watch me. There was the faint shadow of a smile on its lips. It was greatly weather-worn, and that imparted an unpleasant suggestion of disease. I stood looking at it for a little space, half a minute, perhaps a half an hour. It seemed to advance and recede as the hail drove before it, denser and thinner. At last I tore my eyes from it for a moment and saw that the hail curtain had worn threadbare, and that the sky was lightening with a promise of the sun. I looked up again at the crouching white shape, and the full temerity of the voyage came suddenly upon me. What might appear when the hazy curtain was altogether withdrawn? What might not have happened then? What if cruelty had grown into a common passion? What if in this interval the race had lost its manliness and had developed into something inhuman, unsympathetic, and overwhelmingly powerful? I might seem some old-world savage animal, only for the more dreadful and disgusting for our common likeness, a foul creature to be incontinently slain. Already I saw other vast shapes, huge buildings with intricate parapets and tall columns, with a wooded hillside dimly creeping in upon me through the lessening storm. I was seized with a panic fear. I turned frantically to the time machine and strove hard to readjust it. As I did so, the shafts of the sun smote through the thunderstorm. The gray downpour was swept aside and vanished like a trailing garment of a ghost. Above me, in the intense blue of the summer sky, some faint brown shreds of cloud whirled into nothingness. The great buildings about me stood out clear and distinct, shiny with the wet of the thunderstorm and picked out in white by the unmelted hailstones piled along their courses. I felt naked in a strange world. I felt as perhaps a bird may feel in the clear air, knowing that the hawk wings above will swoop. My fear grew to frenzy. I took a breathing space, set my teeth, and again grappled fiercely, wrist and knee, with the machine. I gave under my desperate onset and turned over. I struck my chin violently, one hand on the saddle, the other on the lever. I stood panting heavily in attitude and mounted again. But with this recovery of a prompt retreat, my courage recovered. I looked more curiously and less fearfully at the world of the remote future. In a circular opening high up on the wall of the nearer house, I saw a group of figures clad in rich, soft robes. They had seen me, and their faces were directed towards me. Then I heard voices approach me, coming through the bushes by the white sphinx where the heads and shoulders of men running. One of them emerged in a pathway leading straight to the little lawn upon which I stood with my machine. It was a slight creature, perhaps 4 feet high, clad in a purple tunic, girdled at the waist with a leather belt, sandals, or buskins, I could not clearly distinguish which, were on his feet. His legs were bare to the knees, and his head was bare. Noticing that, I noticed for the first time how warm the air was. He struck me as being a very beautiful and graceful creature, but indiscriminately frail. His flushed face reminded me of a more beautiful kind of consumption, the hectic beauty by which we used to hear so much. At the sight of him, I suddenly regained confidence. I took my hands from the machine. Chapter 5. In the Golden Age. In another moment, we were standing face to face, I and his fragile thing out of futurity. He came straight up to me, and laughed into my eyes. The absence from his bearing of any sign or fear struck me at once. Then he turned to the 2 others who were following him and spoke to them in a strange but very sweet and liquid tongue. There were others coming, and presently a little group of perhaps 8 or 10 of these exquisite creatures were about me. One of them addressed me. It came into my head, oddly enough, that my voice was too harsh and deep for them, so I shook my head and pointed to my ears, shook it again. He came and stepped forward, hesitated, and then touched my hand. Then I felt other soft little tentacles upon my back and shoulders. They wanted to make sure I was real. There was nothing in this at all alarming. Indeed, there was something in these pretty little people that inspired confidence, a graceful gentleness, a certain childlike ease. And besides, they looked so frail that I could fancy myself flinging the whole dozen of them about like 9-pins. But I made a sudden motion to warn them when I saw their little pink hands were feeling at the time machine. Happily then, when it was not too late, I thought of a danger I had hitherto forgotten, and reaching over the bars of the machine, unscrewed the little levers that would set it in motion, and put these in my pocket. Then I turned again to see what I could do in the way of communication. And then, looking more nearly into the features, I saw further peculiarities in their Dresden China type prettiness. Their hair, which was uniformly curly, came to a sharp end at the neck and cheek. There was not the faintest suggestion of it on the face, and their eyes were singularly minute. The mouths were small, with bright red rather than thin lips, and the little chins ran to a point. The eyes were large and mild, and this may seem egotism on my part. I fancied even then that there was a certain lack of the interest I might have expected in them, as they made no effort to communicate with me, but simply stood round me smiling and speaking soft cooing notes to each other. I began the conversation. I pointed to the time machine and to myself. Then, hesitating for a moment how to express time, I pointed to the sun. At once a quaintly pretty little figure in checkered purple and white followed my gesture, and then astonished me by imitating the sound of thunder. For a moment I was staggered, though the import of his gesture was plain enough. The question had come into my mind abruptly. Were these creatures fools? You may hardly understand how it took me. You see, I had always anticipated that people of the year 800 and 2000 odd would be incredibly in front of us in knowledge, art, everything. Then one of them suddenly asked me a question that showed him to be of the intellect level of one of our 5-year-old children. Asked me, in fact, if I had come from the sun in a thunderstorm. He had let loose the judgment I had suspended upon their clothes. Their frail light limbs and fragile features, a flow of disappointment rushed across my mind. For a moment I felt that I had built the time machine in vain. I nodded, pointed to the sun, and gave them such a vivid rendering of a thunderclap as startled them. They all withdrew a pace or so and bowed. Then came one laughing towards me, carrying a chain of beautiful flowers altogether new to me, and put it around my neck. The idea was receiving the melodious applause, and presently they were all running to and fro for flowers, and laughingly flinging them upon me until I was almost smothered with blossom. You who have never seen the like can scarcely imagine what delicate and wonderful flowers countless years of culture had created. Then someone suggested that their plaything should be exhibited in the nearest building, and so I was led past the Sphinx of white marble, which had seemed to watch me all the while with a smile at my astonishment, towards a vast grey edifice of fetid stone. As I went with them, the memory of my confident anticipations of a profoundly grave and intellectual prosperity came with irresistible merriment to my mind. The building had a huge entry and was altogether of colossal dimensions. I was naturally most occupied with the growing crowd of little people, and with the big open portals that yawned before me, shadowy and mysterious. My general impression of the world I saw over their heads was of a tangled waste of beautiful bushes and flowers, a long neglected yet weedless garden. I saw a number of tall spikes of strange white flowers measuring a foot perhaps across the spread of the waxen petals. They grew scattered, as if wild, among the vegetated shrubs, but as I say, I did not examine them closely at this time. The time machine was left deserted on the turf among the rhododendrons. I got it right that time. The arch of the doorway was richly carved, but naturally I did not observe the carving very narrowly, though I fancy I saw suggestions of old Phoenician decorations as I passed through, and it struck me that they were very badly broken and weather-worn. Several more brightly clad people met me in the doorway, and so we entered. I, dressed in dingy 19th century garments, looked grotesque enough, garlanded with flowers, and surrounded by eddying mass of bright, soft-colored robes and shining white limbs, and a melodious whirl of laughter and laughing speech. The big doorway opened into a proportionally great hall hung with brown. The roof was in shadow, and the windows, partially glazed with colored glass and partially unglazed, emitted a tempered light. The floor was made up of huge blocks of some very hard white metal, not plates or slabs, blocks, and it was very much worn, as I judged by the going to and fro of the past generations, as to be deeply channeled along with more frequented ways. Transverse to the length were innumerable tables made of slabs of polished stone, raised perhaps a foot from the floor, and upon these were heaps of fruits. Some I recognized as a kind of hypertrophied raspberry and orange, but the most part they were strange. Between the tables were scattered a great number of cushions. Upon these my conductor seated themselves, signing for me to do likewise. With a pretty absence of ceremony they began to eat the fruit with their hands, flinging peels and stalks and so forth into the round openings at the sides of the table. I did not loth to follow their example, for I felt thirsty and hungry. As I did so, I surveyed the hall at my leisure, and perhaps the thing that struck me most was the dilapidated look. The stained glass windows, which displayed only a geometric pattern, were broken in many places, and the curtains that hung across the lower end were thick with dust. It caught my eye that the corner of the marble table near me was fractured. Nevertheless, the general effect was extremely rich and picturesque. There were perhaps a couple of hundred people dining in the hall, and most of them, seated as near to me as they could come, were watching me with interest, their little eyes shining over the fruit as they were eating. All were clad in the same soft and yet strong silky material. Fruit, by the by, was all their diet. These people of the remote future were strict vegetarians, and while I was with them, in spite of some carnal cravings, I had to be frugivorous also. Indeed, I found afterwards that horses, cattle, sheep, dogs had followed the Ichthyornis into extinction, but the fruits were very delightful. One in particular, that seemed to be in the season at all time, as I was there, a flowery thing in a three-sided husk, was especially good, and I made it my staple. At first I was puzzled by all these strange fruits, and by the strange flowers I saw, but later I began to perceive their import. However, I am telling you of my fruit dinner in the distant future now. So soon as my appetite was a little checked, I determined to make a resolute attempt to learn the speech of these new men of mine. Clearly, that was the next thing to do. The fruit seemed a convenient thing to begin upon. Holding one of these up, I began a series of interrogative sounds and gestures. I had some considerable difficulty in conveying my meaning. At first my efforts met with a stare of surprise or inextinguishable laughter, but presently a fair-haired little creature seemed to grasp my intention and repeated a name. They had to chatter and explain their business at great length to each other, and my first attempts to make their exquisite little sounds of the language caused an immense amount of genuine, if uncivil, amusement. However, I felt like a schoolmaster amidst children and persisted, and presently I had the score of noun substantives at least in my command. and then I got to demonstrative pronouns, and even the verb to eat. But it was slow work, and the little people soon tired and wanted to get away from my interrogations. So I determined, rather of necessity, to let them give their lessons in little doses when they felt inclined. And very little doses I found they were before long, for I never met people more indolent and more easily fatigued. Chapter 6: The Sunset of Mankind. A queer thing I soon discovered about my little hosts, and that was their lack of interest. They would come to me with eager cries of astonishment, like children, but, like children, they would soon stop examining me and wander away after some other toy. The dinner and my conversational beginnings ended. I noted for the first time that almost all those who surrounded me at first were gone. It is odd, too, how speedily I came to disregard these little people. I went out through the portal into the sunlit world again as soon as my hunger was satisfied. I was continually meeting more of these men of the future, who would follow me in a little distance, chatter and laugh about me, and, having smiled and gesticulated in a friendly way, leave me again to my own devices. The calm of the evening was upon the world, and I emerged from the great hall, and the scene was lit by warm glow of the setting sun. At first things were very confusing. Everything was so entirely different from the world I had known, even the flowers. The big building I had left was situate on the slope of a broad river valley, but the Thames had shifted, perhaps a mile from its present position. I resolved to mount to the summit of a crest, perhaps a mile and a half away, from which I could get a wider view of this planet of ours, in the year 800 and 2701 AD. For that, I should explain, was the date the little dials on my machine recorded. As I walked, I was watchful for every impression that could possibly help to explain the condition of the ruinous splendor in which I found the world, for ruinous it was. A little way up the hill, for instance, was a great heap of granite bound together by masses of aluminum, a vast labyrinth of precipitous wall and crumbled heaps, amidst which there were thick heaps of very beautiful pagoda-like plants, nettles possibly, but wonderfully tinted with brown around the leaves and incapable of stinging. It was evidently the derelict remains of some vast structure. To what end was built, I could not determine. It was here that I was destined, at a later date, to have a very strange experience, the first intimation of a still stranger discovery. But of that, I will speak of in its proper place. Looking round with a sudden thought from a terrace on which I rested for a while, I realized that there were no small houses to be seen. Apparently, the single house, and possibly even the household, had vanished. Here and there among the greenery were palace-like buildings, but the house and the cottage, which formed such characteristic features of our own English landscape, had disappeared. Communism, said I to myself. And on the heels of that came another thought. I looked at the half-dozen little figures that were following me, then in a flash I perceived that all had the same form of costume, the same soft hairless visage, and the same girlish rotundity of limb. It may seem strange, perhaps that I had not noticed this before, but everything was so strange. Now I saw the fact plainly enough. In costume and in all the differences of texture and bearing that now mark off the sexes from each other, these people of the future were alike. And the children seemed to my eyes to be but the miniatures of their parents. I judged then that the children of that time were extremely precocious, physically at least, and I found afterwards abundant verification of my opinion. Seeing the ease and security in which these people were living, I felt that the close resemblance of the sexes was after all what one would expect. For the strength of a man and the softness of a woman, the institution of the family, and the differentiation of occupations were all militant necessities of an age of physical force. Where population is balanced and abundant, much childbearing becomes an evil rather than a blessing of the state. Where violence comes but rarely and offspring are secure, there is less necessity, indeed there is no necessity, of an efficient family, and the specialization of sexes with reference to their children's needs. we see some beginnings of this even in our own time, and in the future age it was complete. This, I must remind you, was my speculation at the time. Later, I was to appreciate how far it had fell short of the reality. While I was musing upon these things, my attention was attracted by a pretty little structure, like a well under a cupola. I thought in a transitory way of the oddness of wells still existing, and then resumed the thread of my speculations. There were no large buildings towards the top of the hill, and as my walking powers were evidently miraculous, I was presently left alone for the first time. With a strange sense of freedom and adventure, I pushed on up at the crest. There I found a seat of some yellow metal that I did not recognize, corroded in places with some kind of pinkish rust and half smothered in soft moss, the armrest cast and filled with a resemblance of griffins' heads. I sat down on it and surveyed the broad view of our old world under the sunset of that long day. It was as sweet and fair a view as I had ever seen. The sun had already gone below the horizon line, and the west was flaming gold, touched with some horizontal bars of purple and crimson. Below was the valley of the Thames, in which the river lay like a band of burnished steel. I've already spoken of the great places dotted out amongst the vegetated greenery, some in ruins and some still occupied. Here and there rose a white or silvery figure in the wastes of the garden of the earth. Here and there came the sharp vertical lines of some cupola or obelisk. There were no hedges, no signs of proprietary rights, no evidence of agriculture. The whole earth had become a garden. So, watching, I began to put my interpretation upon the things I had seen, and as it shaped itself to me that evening, my interpretation was something in this way. Afterwards, I found I'd only gotten half the truth, or only a glimpse of one facet of the truth. It seemed to me that I'd happened upon humanity upon the wane. The ruddy sunset set me thinking on the sunset of mankind. For the first time I began to realize an odd consequence of the social effort in which we are presently engaged. And yet, come to think, it is a logical consequence enough. Strength is the outcome of need. Security sets a premium on feebleness. The work of the ameliorated the conditions of life, the true civilizing process that makes life more and more secure, had gone steadily onto a climax. One triumph of a united humanity over nature had followed another. Things that are now mere dreams and had become projects deliberately put in hand and carried forward, and the harvest was what I saw. After all, the sanitation and the agriculture of today are still in a rudimentary stage. The science of our time has attacked but a little dependent of the field of human disease, but even so it spreads its operations very steadily and persistently. Our agriculture and horticulture destroy a weed just here and there and cultivate perhaps a score or so of wholesome land, leaving the greater number to fight out a balance as they can. We prove our favorite plants and animals and how few they are, gradually by selective breeding, now a new and better peach, now a seedless grape, now a sweeter and larger flower, now a more convenient breed of cattle. We improve them gradually because our ideals are vague and tentative, and our knowledge is very limited, because nature, too, is shy and slow in our clumsy hands. Someday, all of this will be better organized, and still better. This is the drift of the current in spite of the eddies. The whole world will be intelligent, educated, and cooperating. Things will move faster and faster towards the subjugation of nature. In the end, wisely and carefully, we shall readjust the balance of animal and vegetable life to suit our human needs. This adjustment, I say, must have been done, and done well. Done indeed for all time, in the space of time across which my machine had leapt. The air was free from gnats, the earth was free from weeds or fungi, everywhere were fruit and sweet and delightful flowers. Brilliant butterflies flew hither and thither. The ideal of preventative medicine was attained. Diseases had been stamped out. I saw no evidence of any contagious diseases during all of my stay. And I shall have to tell you later that even the process of putrefaction and decay had been profoundly affected by these changes. social triumphs too had been affected. I saw mankind housed in splendid shelters, glorious clothed, and as yet as I found them engaged in no toil. There were no signs of struggle, neither social nor economical struggle. The shop, the advertisement, traffic, all that commerce which constitutes the body of our world was gone. It was natural on the golden evening that I should jump at the idea of a social paradise. The difficulty of the increasing population had been met, I guessed, and population had ceased to increase. But with this change in condition comes inevitably adaptations to the change. What, unless biological science is a mass of errors, is the cause of human intelligence and vigor? Hardship and freedom. Conditions under which the active, strong, and subtle survive and the weaker go to the wall. Conditions that put a premium upon the loyal alliance of capable men, upon self-restraint, patience, and decision. And the institution of the family and the emotions that arise therein, the fierce jealousy, the tenderness of the offspring, parental devotion, all found just justification and support in the intermittent dangers of the young. Now, where are all these imminent dangers? There is a sentient rising, and it will grow against connubial jealousy, against fierce maternity, against passions of all sorts, unnecessary things now, and things that make us uncomfortable, savage survivals, discords in a refined and pleasant life. I thought of the physical slightness of the people, their lack of intelligence, and those big abundant ruins, and it strengthened my belief in the perfect conquest of nature. For after the battle comes quiet. Humanity had been strong, energetic, and intelligent, and had used all of its abundant vitality to alter the conditions under which it lived, and now came the reaction of the altered conditions. And that is where we will stop for this evening. Thank you for joining me. I'm sure there will be future episodes where I will need to read further, and I ask you to join me for those. So, with 30 seconds left on the clock, what do I do to fill this time? I think I've got just the thing to counteract all the classical book reading we've just sat through.